welcome to the Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy, the free podcast for motivated teachers and school leaders who want to inspire their students and school community in literacy learning. Make sure you subscribe to the show on your favourite podcast player, and for more amazing literacy resources, check out the show notes provided with every episode.
Hi, I'm Sharon, and I'm the host of a Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy. In every Toolkit episode, we bring you specific resources, tools, strategies, tips, techniques to help you in your job as a teacher of literacy. Firstly, we acknowledge and pay our respects to the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians whose ancestral lands we gather on. We acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Kaurna people to country, and we respect and value their past, present, and ongoing connection to the land and cultural beliefs. Welcome newcomers to the Facebook group, to the podcasts and our Teachific resources. We always love hearing the diverse reasons why teachers across the world are joining, and there's always so much deep and creative literacy work going on in schools. We always love when teachers give a little bit of a comment about why they're wanting to join the podcast and the Facebook group. From a teacher that says, "Hello, I've taught English from years 7 to 12 for 14 years. Thanks for creating this group. The podcasts are excellent. There is always more to learn, and I look forward to that learning." From a pre-service teacher, "I would like to get resources, teaching strategies and fresh ideas to introduce to the classroom. And in our digital world, I'm hoping that this will be a group for online collaboration." And from another teacher, "Strategies and knowledge to better support my prep students as they begin their journey to reading and writing." So if you're not a member of the Teachers Toolkit Facebook group, we would love you to join and introduce yourself to the group. But today we welcome you to this podcast called The Conditions for Learning with Brian Cambourne, and we are thrilled to be welcoming back Brian to the podcast. So welcome, Brian.
Thank you, Sharon. I'm looking forward to it.
Yes, so are we. And if people have tuned into, we've had Brian speaking to us about can writing live without reading? So that one, if people have listened to that, we hope their appetite is well whetted for the discussions today about the conditions of learning. But Brian, we want to introduce you. You have been a long-time teacher and researcher. So you began your teaching career in what Australia had so many of, and they were one-teacher schools in 1956.
That's right, yeah.
Yes, and then when you went on to graduate, you then entered the world of academe as a teacher-educator, and in that time, so since 1965, you have spent thousands of hours as a participant observer in homes and classroom settings where you've documented and analysed how children learn and how teachers teach. And so you are the true, I want to say, defender of teaching and learning, because you have spent so much time engaged in observation and noticing of that time, and that's the richness that you first brought to us. Well, in your first publication, correct me if I'm wrong, but The Whole Story was your first, wouldn't have been your first publication, but the book The Whole Story, Natural Learning and the Acquisition of Literacy in the Classroom, came out, was it in the 80s, Brian?
I think it was first published about 1980, and we got good sales, or Ashton Scholastic, the New Zealand publishing company which published the book,
yes,
got good returns for about 10 years. And then they said, look, just about everybody who wants your book has got it now. Yeah. So we're returning the copyright back to you, and you can share any parts of the book that you like without having to get in touch with us for permission. Right. So that was about 1985 that happened.
Okay, and I know that it's, I think nearly every copy that would now currently be available is a used copy. I know they're still available, but that for me as a teacher really brought a whole new dimension to me, because you were able to articulate so many of I'm going to say, the answers to thinking about what kinds of, not only what am I teaching, but what conditions am I setting up to have rich, vibrant and classroom environment that I can really ensure that I've got students fully engaged in their learning. So today we want to be able to talk about the conditions for learning. Actually, you've got the conditions for learning and the processes that enable learning. So I hope we get to talk about both of those parts today. But let's start off by thinking about, in our classrooms, a lot of the things that teachers will often bring up is that, they see the elements that children might be missing, we might not see them applying their learning, or we might not see them being engaged in their learning, or we might not see them being, knowing how to respond to their learning or how we're responding to it. But what I know you're going to talk with us about today as we go through the conditions of learning is actually how all of these conditions don't live in isolation, but it's in the collective, that they're all interrelated, they function together, and in that way, when we consider them together, the total effect is much greater than the sum of any one of these individual parts. So the conditions, can I just read the list of them first, Brian, and then
Sure.
we'll delve into them. So engagement, immersion, demonstration, response, approximation, use/employment, responsibility, expectations. And those together, these are conditions that are inherent, you found, in classrooms in which learners are encouraged to use reading, writing, speaking and listening to explore and make sense of their world. So out of those conditions, I'd really love you to be able to take us on a journey today through each of those conditions, but knowing that separately they're not as powerful as they are collectively, and that if you can sort of talk a little bit about each of those conditions and the kinds of ways that, through your observations, some of those things where you really saw those coming alive in classrooms. So, well, do I need to ask you first, do you want to talk a little bit about maybe giving us just a little bit of how did the conditions for learning even come about? I mean, I know it was from your classroom observations, but how did they start forming? Maybe we can talk there first.
There's a fairly long history to it, with lots of different threads that came together for me in my very first few years of teaching. I went to a 2-year pre-service training college in the days when the New South Wales Department of Education owned and ran all of the teachers' colleges in New South Wales. Mm-hmm. And I got a scholarship to Bathurst Teachers College, as it was called in those days, and I arrived there in 1954, and it was a 2-year course. And at that time, the dominant theory in education or learning or teaching was at its core what some psychologists would call behaviourist principles. And during that time at that college, we were given a thorough grounding in behaviourist learning principles. And I did pretty well at that 2-year training college. I think I came 11th out of 180 or something at our final evaluation. And when I started in schools, I sought to apply what I'd been taught in my pre-service teacher education course, which was applying the behaviourist conditions to my classrooms. Mm-hmm. And after a couple of years of doing this, I became very aware of a recurring kind of pattern, and that is that it didn't matter how many kids I had in my class, and in those days classes varied between 30 and 32, there would always be a small but significant group that I couldn't seem to teach anything to. And I would try to help them by applying what I'd learned about behaviourism.
Mm-hmm.
And I soon realised that it wasn't working. And I thought, why? I'm doing what I was taught by my psychology lecturers at Teachers College, but it doesn't seem to be working. I wonder what's going on. And then the thought struck me was, in order to answer that question, I asked some of the senior teachers that I knew that were in the district why I was experiencing this group of kids to whom I could never seem to teach anything. And the explanation that I got was typically what we call today a deficit explanation.
Right.
I remember one of the inspectors of schools that I raised this question with during one of his visits to my classroom. And he said, look, Brian, all you can do is keep those kids busy. And that's all we expect you to do. And I think he said something along the lines of, like the poor, this group of kids who don't seem to be able to respond to teaching will always be with us. There's nothing you can do about it except keep them occupied in ways that don't disturb the rest of the class. Now, I knew that there was a conflict there because some of the kids that fell into that group of not being able to learn anything that I taught them outside of the school setting illustrated that they were quite capable of complex learning. You know, there were kids who came to Australia in those days as immigrants with no language, who in a very short time mastered what I called playground English.
Yes.
And were doing things like accompanying their parents to real estate agents to sign a tenancy agreement. And I thought, these kids are capable of doing complex learning. I can remember one little guy I taught in sixth class whose father was the local illegal bookmaker. We called them SP bookies in those days. He would sit in the playground with a pack of cards and he would start up games, a rummy-like game where you had to get pairs and know when the cards that you were looking for to make up your sets of, 4 twos or 4 aces or whatever, you had to almost understand in an intuitive way, a primitive way, the probability or probability theory.
Yes.
And this little sixth grade guy was amazing. Not only did he win every game, but when I talked to him about how he did it, he said, well, I observe the cards that have been played. I have a fair idea of how many of the cards that I'm looking for are still in the pack.
Yes.
And so I concentrate very, very carefully on what cards have been played and what cards haven't. And that directs me on how I can get rid of my cards as quickly as possible and win the game. And what that kid was telling me was that even though I couldn't teach him anything, he almost had an expert's intuitive knowledge of probability theory.
Yeah.
So that alerted me to the fact that perhaps, horror of horrors, that there was nothing wrong with the kids. They could still learn. It's just that they couldn't learn in my classroom. So perhaps that behaviourist theory that I was trying to put into place was at fault. And that in turn set me on a university course to explore this phenomenon in more detail. And that's what I did virtually for the rest of my teaching life. I spent hours in classrooms observing how kids engaged with what the teachers were asking them to engage with, and trying to get them to explain to me why they were engaging so deeply and what was going through their minds as they did that. And that's where the conditions of learning came from thousands and thousands of pages of observations and kind of non-directive interviews with kids and teachers, and then that's where those conditions started to emerge.
And really, you've got that question in there that reflective teachers are always asking. So it's teachers asking that of themselves, what in my teaching can I do differently to reach all my learners? Because there are the two ways of thinking, aren't there? That we think, okay, it's the learners, what problem are they having, or what is it about my classroom that isn't yet right for them to engage in the learning? So your research is what we really want to get inside your head around that today, Brian, for you to bring to us your insights into each of these conditions so that we as teachers can, and as listeners be thinking about, right, in my classroom, where might I be able to reach more learners through considering each of these conditions, and then, to think about that they don't, just by bringing one in doesn't mean that I'm changing everything, that there is this wonderful connectedness around all of these aspects. So the conditions, let's explore them one by one so that we can make more sense of what that then looks like, what we as teachers are doing with that in a classroom to absolutely capture our learners.
Okay. Again, it's a fairly long and complicated story with a long history, but one of the things that I did in my university studies, and in those days it was all by correspondence. Our Department of Education encouraged young teachers like me to sign up with the first bachelor's course run by the University of Armidale in those days.
Right.
And while I was there, I thought to myself, can I find an example of really effective and successful learning that is pretty universal for kids all around the world, irrespective of what culture they're born into, and perhaps by observing them engaged in that learning, that complex stuff, I can identify the contextual conditions that seem to support it. So I read around looking for complex learning experiences that everybody would be familiar with. And the one that I came up with was learning how to talk. The question I put to myself was, how do little kids between the ages of 0 and 5 learn something as complex as the language of the culture into which they were born? And it was a question that had a lot of complexity behind it. But what I eventually did was then I was awarded a scholarship to observe toddlers between the ages of about 2 and 6 in their day-to-day living and experiences in order to find out how they managed at such a young age to learn something as complex as the language culture into which they were born. It was from that kind of naturalistic inquiry where I would arrive at a kid's home before they woke up in the morning. The physics department at my university had built me a little transmittable radio microphone that was sensitive up to about a radius of 3 or 4 yards. And I would get the parents to hook that up to their clothing after they were dressed. And then I would sit outside in a car with a radio receiver that was playing directly into a tape recorder. And I also had a pair of field glasses, and where I could, I would observe the kids when they came out of their house and went into their backyard to play, or when Mum took them up to the local school and dropped them off. And even when they were in school, I could hear what was happening, and it was being recorded. And to cut a long story short, I ended up with thousands and thousands of pages of these interactions, and then I had to go through them very, very carefully and look for patterns that could help explain why these kids were engaging, how they were engaging, and how they were actually learning or mastering the complex grammar and vocab of whatever language culture they'd been born into. And what I found interesting was it didn't matter what language culture you were born into, Chinese, Japanese, indigenous languages. These kids, if certain conditions were in place, seemed to be successful at learning. I also found some literature which indicated that when kids were not given these opportunities, say like there was a famous case in America when I was doing this work called Genie, Genie, and it was a story of a little girl whom they gave the pseudonym Genie to, who had fairly unstable parents who locked her away in a room, put her in a cot, fed her, changed her, and left her in the cot all day. And when the social workers came through that city and found her, they found, an 8 or 10-year-old kid who really had no idea of how the English language worked. The book goes on to show that over time she learned a little bit of English, but never to the depth or degree that more normal kids would learn their languages by being treated the way that parents and caregivers who aren't unstable, who are quite sane and normal, would offer to their kids. And, that's where the conditions came from. If you think about immersion, well, that's probably the very first condition, or that's the main condition, or one of the main conditions for getting kids started on learning to talk. From the moment that they're born, kids are surrounded by others using the language that they ultimately have to come to learn. And so we need to think of immersion in the classroom in those kinds of terms. What's the equivalent of immersing kids in, say, how to read than immersing them in how to talk? How do parents and caregivers immerse kids in those settings? And what kind of demonstrations do they give them about how the language works? I can remember that there was a very strong school of thought at that time which said that parents actually correct their kids when they make linguistic errors, and that's how the kids are gradually shaped up into learning the language. Now, when I looked at my data, that simply wasn't true. Parents did demonstrate, but they did it in a fairly subtle way. I can remember one example that I think I quoted in the whole story was listening to a family of 4 at the morning breakfast. There was mum and dad, a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old toddler. And as breakfast was being consumed, they would demonstrate how the language worked. Like I can remember one father saying to the mother, "Can you pass the butter, please?" Now, pass the butter is a demonstration of the kind of language you need to get control of in order to get what you want for breakfast. And while one of the kids was 4 and the other one was only 2, they're quite different cognitive abilities at that stage. The parents didn't teach each kid separately and correct them separately. Rather, they provided the demonstration, pass the butter please, and the 2 children at the table would engage with different parts of that particular demonstration. Yeah. The 4-year-old might engage with it because he sees it as a demonstration of how you ask a question to get something, whereas the 2-year-old probably would engage with something like the flow of a language, where you put your intonation and your emphasis and so on.
Yes.
And so throughout their learning to talk career, kids got thousands and thousands, I'd say millions of those kinds of demonstrations. And gradually through the responses that the caregivers gave them to their attempts at using language, the wisdom of letting kids approximate and honouring their approximations, and the expectations that you communicated in the language that you used in the classroom, these all provided opportunities for kids to construct meanings, to make sense out of the symbolic system that they were tuned into, namely their own native tongue. And I can remember one event from a family I was listening to. The parent and the toddler, who was about 2 or 3, were in the bedroom, and Mum was making the beds and tidying up. And the little toddler picked up one of his father's socks that Dad had left on the floor, and he showed it to his mother, and he said, Daddy, sock. Now, if you think about it, that's really poor grammar. He couldn't pronounce the word that properly. Mm. He left out the verb to be, is, and the response that his parent gave him was typical of the responses that most caretakers give to their children. They accept and acknowledge the approximation as having meaning, yes, and then they give a response which runs the demonstration by them again and gives the kids a chance to keep talking about that particular event. Mm. And I remember this parent said, yes, that's acknowledging the kid's approximation. Mm-hmm. They're what Grandma bought him for Christmas, aren't they? And it was by doing that and providing the child with a rerun, if you like, of the original sentence, yes, that's Daddy's sock, they're what Grandma bought him for Christmas. And that was if you like, the key example of how you use the approximations, how you convey the expectations that this is something you have to attend to, kid. If you want to be a member of our culture, you've got to learn to talk like us. Mm. So you can't opt out. It's non-negotiable. And my data showed that the majority of kids where teachers were able to do this would engage very deeply with the demonstrations and the responses that they got to their approximations. So, it was a fairly complex analytic exercise. It took me years and years and years, but it was as a consequence of that those conditions emerged. Probably the best metaphor I can think of is it's a bit like a web. Imagine a spider's web with, on the outside layer, each of the conditions in one of the spaces between the silken threads, and as you work into the centre, you get more and more connections between each of these conditions. And, it's like the web kind of vibrates. And if all of the conditions are working well, the web keeps, if you like, in my mind, the web keeps making links between all of those conditions and how they work. And so I usually tell teachers to think of organising the conditions of learning, or an organising frame for them was to think of a web-like framework. And it's really the way that I think epitomises how women think. Men are not what I would call reflective thinkers. They would try to correct it by telling the kid where they went wrong, rather than letting the kids have a go and then using that response that they had as a springboard, if you like, for drawing their attention to other aspects of whatever you're demonstrating. That's very complex, I know, but, it is a complex process. It's not easy. It's not something you can just throw over your classroom, in a day or two.
No.
It takes a while.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's exactly what, the idea of, the web. And for those, I meant to say at the beginning of the podcast, actually, that in the show notes there will be the article that both you and Deborah Crouch have written called Teaching Decisions That Bring the Conditions of Learning to Life. Yeah. And in there on page 4 is a diagram, that is a visual of this web.
Yeah.
And so people might even like to, if they've got the opportunity, to pause and download that article and look at that web, because I think in seeing that, it's a good representation of the kinds of complexity that you're talking about here, and that this isn't, as you say, something that we just overlay into a classroom, over a couple of days. It's actually something that we overlay on not just the classroom, but in fact the multiple interactions that we have within a day, because it's those sorts of, it's not about just all right, our classroom has these as, an overlaying model of learning. They play out thousands and thousands of times in any day. Mm-hmm. In those opportunities that are presented, even down to, that very example that you give of a child saying something, or let's say they're reading, our response, to their attempt of that, the way we respond through what might be the demonstration that we give, but acknowledging the approximation, how, in that little demonstration of how might we adjust that to use that in a more efficient way, but them taking the responsibility and the expectation. So all of these pieces are playing out simultaneously, but what I think you're really bringing to our attention is the mindfulness that we can take in bringing those elements, each of those elements of the conditions into play or really lead from that, what a child's very capable of, into it being a deeper learning rather than just a single response to it. It's right or it's wrong, or to really keep building that, the child's independence in learning too. Mm-hmm. So in this diagram, because I've got it sitting in front of me, let me just ask, so in this diagram, engagement is really the middle piece in this web. So if we pictured this web, you have engagement as the central part.
Yeah.
So Can you talk to us a little bit about the engagement condition?
Right. Engagement is a term or a concept which the late, great Frank Smith first made us aware of when he wrote a really, for me anyway, seminal article in the old Language Arts Journal.
Mm-hmm.
And what he described was that it was a mixture of a subtle mix of motivation. Kids had to be motivated to attend to the demonstration. It had a lot to do with, I found that I had to read a lot into the concept of attention. So kids won't learn from a demonstration unless they attend to the demonstration. And engagement is a kind of a mix of all of those psychological phenomena: motivation, attendance, attention, and it's, let me see, how can I put this? The best way I can probably describe it is through an analogy I used to use with teachers to help them get the big picture. And I would tell them how at the university where I worked at the time, it wasn't very far from a gliding club,
Right.
where they used to mount their gliders and jump off the cliff and would float and spiral their way down and land in the football oval just outside my lecture room. And the students tell me that they'd be listening to me lecture and taking notes, and then there were probably a minute's silence. They didn't know what was going on. And they tell me that I was looking out the window, watching these elegant little aeroplanes, I suppose you could call them, gliders, land. Mm-hmm. And I think I was definitely motivated to watch and attend to these demonstrations of hang gliding, but I didn't engage terribly deeply. Like if you ask me to sketch what a hang glider looked like, I'd be very hard put to do that. Even though I attended and I was motivated, I definitely didn't engage very deeply. And I asked myself why, and it was pretty obvious that I was frightened I would hurt myself, kill myself, badly injure myself. You know, I was too old and not very nimble, and didn't like heights very much. And so all of those things in my background worked against me engaging terribly deeply with those demonstrations that were highly motivating and I really loved attending to. I couldn't engage with them while I didn't believe that I was capable of doing it without injuring myself. Yeah. And I think there's a similarity there to when kids, are learning to talk or when they're learning anything.
Yes.
What do they need to feel and understand in order to engage deeply with this demonstration?
Yeah.
And most of the language that teachers who understand this use in the classroom is language that tries to get the kids to, instead of talking about learning or teaching, use the concept of making meaning. So teachers who really understood this, in my opinion, I would hear them saying things today like, now our next lesson is biology, and we're going to make some meanings about the biological concepts in whatever topic we were studying. And so I was trying to get the kids to, if you like, put a moratorium on using words like learn or teach or any of their derivatives, and replace it instead with making meaning. And after a while, I noticed the kids started to do this. They would say, I would ask them, what are you doing now? Oh, well, we're making meaning about whatever biological topic or mathematical topic they were studying. So I would advise that it's really effective if you can authentically help your kids understand what meaning making is all about and how grown-ups and others and good learners think about learning as a process of making meaning rather than a process of rote memorisation and regurgitation, which is what behaviourism really is all about.
Yes, yeah. Oh, I've just made a big connection there, Brian, to, when we, because engagement really does start with our students understanding how, and it's not just it's how the demonstration of what is happening, why it is important to them in making meaning, whether it's as a reader or as a writer. So I'm just thinking from that literacy aspect, or as a, word worker, to bring that word meaning to it. That's a big one for me, to not only include the, I often talk to teachers or, to students about what I'm demonstrating is important, in what way they're going to be using that as a reader or a writer, but by including the word meaning in there, what meaning we're going to make then, that's a real strength for me to take from that, that I think that word meaning is, a critical part of our, for those people who are writing in some schools, they write learning intentions. What's the intention for learning? But actually, if we're not getting to what it is that, and that the learning is also linked to a demonstration. And I suppose that's that shift from, in a behaviourist kind of model, we don't necessarily have a demonstration. We're just told what we're going to be doing. We don't get to even see what we're going to be doing. But through the seeing, that's where we absolutely can bring to it that idea about meaning, and therefore how we can move forward with that ourselves as learners.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's important is you always include the concept of making meaning.
Making meaning, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Because when you talk about kids making meaning, you are informing them that you really believe that they are capable of constructing their own meaning,
yes.
and that they'll get support from other class members and from other adults who understand this. They'll get supportive comments that will, if you like, draw their attention back to whatever it is you're demonstrating and explore other aspects of it. So it's a kind of system where kids construct meanings, share them with others, and as a consequence of what they hear others, the meanings that others have made, they deconstruct their own responses and then reconstruct them by including whatever bits of what the other students have been sharing that they think will help them. So, there's this constant cycle of constructing, deconstructing and reconstructing going on in the opportunities that teachers create for kids to make meaning. It's really a very important part of the language that you use in the classroom. Today we're going to make meaning about, or they were good meanings that you made there. One of the other things that I did quite recently with a group of young teachers who were trying to fill out their teacher certification, trying to meet the teacher's certification demands. 4 of them signed up with me to explore how they can change their language and get their kids more deeply engaged. So one of the things that we agreed upon was that a really bad metaphor or simile that teachers constantly use was to refer what it is that they did in classrooms as work. And I said, let's see if we can go back to your classrooms and do one of your literacy sessions and see if you can do it without invoking the notion of what you're doing is work, which, suggests it's a chore and unpleasant and you've got no choice in the matter. Yeah. Well, they went back and tried it, and when we met for a debriefing, they said we had to really concentrate very hard to watch our language, and after about 5 or 10 minutes it became just too exhausting. And I couldn't do it. It's going to take a long time, one of them said, for me to really find a way of not using the work metaphor, but keep reinforcing the constructive metaphor, the meaning-making metaphor. Yes. We began then to tape record our lessons, and we would share them with each other. And we came up with lots of interesting ways of avoiding the notion of work and calling and using in the classroom and calling what we do as meaning-making. It's if you don't do that, if you stick to the behaviourist kind of response by telling the kids they were wrong and then giving them the correct answer and then getting them to practice applying that correct answer, if you do that, you end up with what I call dependent learners, kids who can't really make a decision about their own learning and who are expecting the teacher to tell them what to do. I can remember one teacher I worked very closely with, I wrote a book with, was a lady called Hazel Brown. And I can remember turning up at her classroom on day one of the school year, and she was getting a second class, which had been a grade 1 class last year, with one of those mother hen type teachers who, tell the kids everything. Tell them when to sit up, when to line up, when to pick up their pencil, when to put it down, how to put your hand up and so on. And I can remember one little girl came out to the desk with her pencil and said, "Please, Mrs. Brown, my pencil's broken." And Hazel Brown said, "Well, so it is. Go and fix it." And it took a while, but soon the majority of that class realised that Mrs. Brown wasn't going to mother hen them like their teacher last year did, and they were going to, it was not negotiable that you had to resolve these problems yourself if you could, and after you'd tried a few approximations and still weren't having any success, then you can come and ask Mrs. Brown and she'll find a way of helping you. That's the kind of climate or ethos that I think teachers who really understand the conditions of learning and how they work together, this is what they do in their classrooms. They organise the way they distribute themselves across the time in the classroom in ways that enable their kids to make meaning, deconstruct, reconstruct, and gradually work their way towards the final form of whatever it is they're trying to learn at that time.
Can you just talk a little bit more about the use, practice and employment part within that? Because that approximation part is, you've touched on that and the critical nature of that. Within the conditions of learning, use and practice and employment look very different than if we're talking a behaviourist model.
Yeah.
So can you talk us through, like, I just want to keep listening to, your and the language that you use around that, because I think that that's really helpful for us to take into classrooms then around what kind of language, what kinds of ways are we talking when it comes to that use and practice and employment condition.
Let me see. One of the really successful little procedures that the teachers that I worked with, who I thought really understood this, one of the little strategies they employed was that they would always preface the learning task that they were about to ask the kids to engage with a subtle message of how it would help you learn better or learn to be a better reader or writer. It was, like, for example, many teachers use worksheets, ditto sheets, what some of my friends in America call the blue plague, because they use sort of blue ink copying machines to copy out worksheets for the kids. And even if the worksheet was, something that I disagreed with, I can remember one teacher using a worksheet which had lots of rabbits on it, most of the rabbits looking to the right and one or two of them looking to the left. You know that kind of worksheet?
Yes.
And the successful teachers would say the task was to put a circle around the bunnies that are looking the other way. So they had to circle the two bunnies that were looking to the left. But the teacher would say, I want you to do this exercise because it will help you become a better reader. It will help you learn and look for letters and the way that they are positioned on a page. Sometimes B's and P's can get confused with D's because they're just, a circle and a stick. But the way that they're oriented on the page are really important. So this little exercise using the bunnies is one that will help you become more familiar with words and letters and how they form patterns on the page. Now, that's a fairly simple little thing, but if you get into the habit of doing it, the kids eventually start to understand why you want them to do that rather than just as something to keep them busy while you mark the roll or something like that.
Yes. So the why we want them to do it and what it will help them to do.
Yeah.
Yes.
How it will further the purposes of their life.
Yes.
Like me with the hang glider, I definitely knew that learning to hang glide would not further the purposes of my life.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yes. No, so I really like that as a way that we can, and I think that's a thread that's coming through, for all of the conditions of learning. It's really about the language we use around all of them, and that no matter in what way we are currently operating as a teacher, that we can actually, with a change of some language and with a change of thinking about, how are we learning or how are we making meaning from this? Like that even relates back to what you've just said, that how do we, all right, if we're looking at these rabbits, how are we making meaning from, okay, I'm learning to, discern which ones are facing the other way and and what's the transfer for that. So from that use and practice and employment strategy or condition, it really is being explicit and clear about the what this, and we might give some information about that, and then students might also, if we leave that open for what meaning did they make from that, then we're going to be able to hear the kinds of thinking that they're doing that we won't have otherwise, if it's just circle which bunnies, go the right way, but it is that actual opportunity to talk about it and to say, okay, this is the meaning I've made from that, and to be aware of that. that's going to progress their own thinking no matter what tasks they come to then. It's really building that disposition too, isn't it, of them being very cognizant of the thinking that they're doing as they're trying things out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's what I called in the whole story meta-textual awareness. That is, it's kind of metacognition,
Right.
helping kids become consciously aware of how the language or the maths or whatever actually work. Another example I can think of from those teachers that I thought were putting the conditions in place successfully is a strategy that we eventually called Never Let a Chance Go By, Go By. Can you remember a pop song called Never Let a Chance Go By, Go By?
Oh, yes, no, I'm not sure I do.
Way back in the 70s. But that's what triggered it for me. And as these successful teachers were roving and hitting base with kids at different desks who were engaged in making meaning in some task that she'd set them, she would suddenly say, everyone stop work. She would interrupt the flow of learning that was going on and say, I want to share with you what little Johnny over here has just done in learning to spell. Let me share with you how Johnny spelt the word mother. And she would, if you like, stop the flow and redirect the kids' attention to some aspect of the language or the reading or the spelling or the writing that they were currently engaged in. And I also found that teachers who got into the habit of doing that created, or if you like, subtly forced the kids to attend to and engage with something that one of their peers had learned which was really worth knowing. And they didn't do it too much, but once, twice, three times during a 2-hour language block, they would always work a Never Let a Chance Go By little strategy in.
I like that, and that really feeds into, well, because it's modelling how I can, first of all, it's noticing, isn't it? It's noticing that this is something that's worth bringing to everybody's attention in a very simple, easy way that isn't taking much time. It's using something that's already happening. And as a teacher, I remember how powerful that process is, because all of a sudden everybody looks at their own, whatever that related to, and almost give themselves some feedback or response to themselves right then about, oh, yeah, I could do that, or I tried something like that, and oh, yeah, yep, I can make a connection there with, that working. But it also lets students know the kinds of things that are worth sharing with others as well.
Yeah.
That, wow, here's my thing to share. Even if that doesn't get shared with the whole class, sharing it even to myself, sharing it, with the person next to me, going, oh, yeah. So that metacognition, but that, what did you call it? The metatextual awareness. Is such a great, once again, language to bring in and tool, these little, as you say, maybe it only happens 2 or 3 times in, a block of time, but we don't have to just wait for that. If we've got a share time at the end of a lesson, it doesn't have to just wait to then. We know when it's appropriate to go, oh, that is so worth sharing. And if I don't catch that now, the chance has gone by. Yeah. So the response strategy or condition, I know you talked a little bit about it earlier, but there is also, and this has touched on that, the power of not just the teacher being the one giving response, but that it's the community, who are all able to join in with responding, because we're learning, once again, through the language, what to respond to, what's worth responding to. And I particularly like, I'll keep coming back to that, that meaning-making bit, that can always be something that we can respond to, how we've made meaning. And so I think that really, for me, sort of elevates that whole idea of response being something much stronger than what we might get in that behaviourist kind of model of it's right or it's wrong. Mm-hmm. Now we're into another, big layer of, connecting those things across the conditions that we're responding to, what we saw in a demonstration or what we discovered as we were immersed or as we were applying and using, or against the expectation. So response really comes into every, like all the conditions do, comes into every aspect of the conditions, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. They all work together. I think the term is synergy.
Yes.
The whole is greater than the sum of its parts, that kind of thinking.
Yes, yeah.
And I can remember presenting the conditions of learning to a group of, in those days, what we used to call infants mistresses. They were usually female principals of the K-2 part of a school.
Yes.
And I was doing a workshop with a whole group of them at one time. And I can remember one of these female principals came to me and said, "Look, I really love what you're telling us, about the conditions of learning, and I'm going to really go and try and put them into place in my school. Next staff meeting, I'm going to share all of the conditions of learning that you've demonstrated to us today, and we're going to work on how we can, as a school, implement them in all of our classrooms." But she said, "I can't go along with approximation, so I'm going to do the 7 conditions, but not approximation." And I felt like saying, but I didn't, I felt like saying, that's a little bit like being a little bit pregnant.
Yes, yeah.
And,
yes,
you have to get that kind of concept across, that all of these conditions have to be there in order for efficient or effective learning to take place.
Yes, yes. In fact, in kind of saying that I don't understand or I don't agree with, and we won't have this part, is really actually discounting all parts.
Yeah, well, she still, even though she probably wasn't aware of it, she was still applying a behaviourist approach to teaching and learning, which was her value system, her belief system at that time.
Yeah.
Before any changes could take place in that particular school, they'd all have to examine what they believe and understand about what effective learning is, and try to see how their view and their values of learning either matched or didn't match the conditions of learning. And that could be a quite painful exercise for some of them, to actually change the theory that they have in their head about how kids learn and what knowledge is and so on.
Yeah. The idea of schools, if we just talk a little bit about that, schools will sometimes look for, what is their pedagogy around learning. Sometimes I do hear schools say, we don't seem to be getting engagement, so let's work on engagement, or let's work on having more explicit teaching. A good strategy for people to think about when they are noticing that some of these elements, and if they can name some of those, are missing, is much more powerful if they think about them as the whole, though, thinking of them, how they work together, because it really is only in their working together that the deep learning is going to come about.
Yeah.
So whether it's a teacher, whether it's a school thinking about it, we really would encourage people they can dip a little bit further into more examples of how that plays out in the classroom through Deborah Crouch's and your book, or through this article, which is called, the article is Teaching Decisions That Bring the Conditions of Learning to Life. And there is a section of that article, the first part of it really outlines all of the conditions and the processes. And just quickly, the processes that you talk about that really overlay those conditions. So the processes, transformation.
Yeah.
So transformation relates to?
It's a term, I chose transform because I think a really good evaluation or indicator that kids are getting a grasp of what it is that you're trying to teach them is if they can apply what they're learning to a new situation.
Yeah.
Like, for example, I think the one example I used to use was that Tiger Woods' father coached him, taught him how to swing the club and how to hold the club and everything like that. But ultimately, Tiger changed some of those things to suit his own particular way of going about things. And that, to me, is a transformation.
Yeah.
It's a kind of paraphrase. You take a set of meanings that someone else has shared with you and put them into your own words. And by being able to do that, you are transforming that knowledge into something that you can apply to new situations and in that way, become a problem identifier and a problem solver, which is what I think we need. That's what's missing in our schools today. I don't see too much of this reflective thinking going on with the kids in the classroom. Particularly at secondary level, most teachers tell me that when they say to kids, I want you to do this, this or this, usually the first question is this going to be in the exam? Or is this how you're going to assess it?
Yes.
And if I say no, then they just don't do it. They don't engage at all. And we've built that kind of culture into our schools over the last 50 or 60 years, the testing and evaluation and reporting that teachers have to do don't leave much time for them to do teaching.
Yes,
They're doing more administration than anything else.
And so the transformation, I know there's a term you also use around that. It's about, transformation is about owning your learning.
Yeah.
That
it's yours.
It's making, that you have made the learning your own.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree that that's something that we really want to fight to get back. We want learners to feel that they not only own it, they're in charge of it. They can go, even if I don't know immediately what to apply in this situation, I'm going to use effort to I'm going to try this, I'll try that, I'm owning it, I'm taking it, and I really feel that the Australian curriculum has really been written with that emphasis, that it is about, we take that learning, that we are applying it, that we're using it, that we're identifying, that we are really active learners. And would that be what you say transformation is really being the active learner, owning it, taking it and using it. All right, so that's one of the processes that enables it. you also talk about discussion and reflection. In fact, you've already touched on that about the being reflective learners and the importance of, I suppose, not just owning the learning, but discussing and reflecting it is also articulating the learning.
That's right. And reflecting is really articulating it to yourself.
Yes,
You can discuss it with colleagues and friends and others, and that's a very important thing to do. But it's also important that every now and then you ask yourself
yes,
the same questions and try to become, if you like, metacognitively aware of how you are recognising and identifying problems and what tools you have to go about solving them.
yes, yeah. What about evaluation as a process?
That kind of evaluation is really self-evaluation. Learners need to every now and then ask the question, how am I going? And ask it of themselves.
Yes.
How do I think I'm going here? What can I do next? It's another part of that metacognition or metatextual awareness of not only knowing why, but knowing how and knowing what.
Oh, and that's that real shift from feedback to evaluation, to asking ourselves how we're going and not just, and that we model that as teachers. Because actually in all of these, we're talking here about all of these conditions for learning. This comes right back to the very beginning where you started in that very first question to yourself about how can I be more effective? What can I be doing to enable my students to be more effective in their learning? And all of these things, that we say, okay, we want children to be asking themselves, well, how am I doing as a learner? Well, we have to give them the time to ask themselves that question.
Yeah.
And we need to model that. And we sometimes need to lead with that question, don't we? To not just give feedback, but to go, hey, so what was it that you were trying to do here? How are you doing with it? So all of the conditions and all of these processes really do ask of us as teachers to think about the language that we're using, the questions we're asking, the opportunities we're opening up and providing and leading with, so that our students can really do their best learning.
Yeah.
Yeah. Our best tools and resources are the questions we ask and the language we use. Would it be? Like they're really probably our strongest tools that we can use as teachers around the conditions and giving our students time. It's that application and use, doing that as authentic readers and writers and not just about the work that we do. I really like that shift from the teachers saying, what work are we doing here? But the work is, as a reader, it's the work of the reader. It's the work of the writer, not necessarily. I'm just back to those worksheets again, Brian. Brian, worksheets, is there ever a good worksheet?
Worksheets, I think, were originally devices for keeping kids quiet or getting them to practice some skill over and over again, or provide opportunities for them to explore and construct their own meanings. So I think basically at the core of it is what some researchers call embedded metaphors in our language, and what some others call the discourse of the classroom. And discourse is the language that we use to describe and clarify what meanings we want to get across to our kids. And Deborah and I discovered that there are two basic kinds of discourse, what we call the discourse of acquisition and the discourse of meaning-making. And the discourse of acquisition is one which subtly implies that knowledge or learning is some kind of stuff that is tangible and can be moved around, repackaged, stored away and put in different places,
Right.
whereas the discourse of meaning-making is one in which the main message is that knowledge is not some kind of stuff that we can use and package and measure and weigh. It's really the end result of all the meanings we've ever constructed in our lives. And so it's a quite different kind of language use. If you believe that knowledge or learning is really just meaning-making, then the discourse that you use in the classroom is quite different than if you think that knowledge is some thing or stuff that you can acquire. That's one of the things that I regret is the title on the subtitle on the whole story, natural learning and the acquisition of literacy.
Yes.
I wish that I hadn't used that term because acquire is a verb and acquisition is a noun, which implies that knowledge is stuff that can be acquired, that can be passed around and so on. Whereas if you believe in the conditions of learning, then your discourse is one which emphasises that knowledge is meaning, the meanings that you've made, and it's not some kind of stuff that you can package or measure.
So I asked you, about, is there such a thing as a good worksheet? I think this, defining those two really is a good way for schools to even look sometimes when they're thinking about, are they going to purchase this program, or this package of something, that using the conditions of learning as a lens to think about how is the learner constructed in this package or in this program is a good way for schools to, if they're on that track of really wanting to have for their learners the natural learning conditions that you've identified as part of their ongoing learning lives, then we can look at packages and programs much more critically to say, yes, that enables our students to engage in the conditions of learning, or no, it doesn't. Or if this doesn't and it's here already, how can we adjust that, and what language can we wrap around that, and how can we use demonstration and approximation and use and all of those things to enable our students to be able to engage in the learning, and I'm using that word intentionally, but to engage in the learning process in its fullness. Yeah. Brian, thank you so much for your generosity of sharing with us not only the insights, but that honest and open journey that you've been on, that we can bring to our students from those thousands and thousands of hours of listening, noticing, looking for patterns and synthesizing that knowledge for us, that we can, with real integrity, bring to us, in our profession, to help us think about how is it that we can provide conditions that will enable all of our learners, to achieve the learning that they are well and truly capable of.
Yeah.
It's been such a valuable and empowering chat. And well, actually, it hasn't been so much of a chat today. I just have not wanted to interrupt you at all, quite frankly. Really just wanted you to share with us. And there were so many people that responded after your last podcast and about how much they'd learned, and people are well and truly ready for and have been asking for more from you, Brian. So thank you so much for bringing, as I said, your insights into that, ready for us to be using, to be thinking about and applying ourselves in our own settings.
And thank you for providing the opportunity, you and Phil. I think what you're doing in South Australia is fabulous stuff, and it's one of the few sources of good constructivist learning and professional development that is available for teachers in our country today. So, well, I'm very grateful for it.
Well, and that's very mutual, Brian, because without the conditions for learning have truly been, a foundation of what we as teachers, and not just teachers, but, the impact that's had in our own lives, for our own learning, has been, you've given us ways of understanding the power of learning, the power of those conditions to really, to make learning such an enriching experience. And, and it's something that, I think as teachers, we want that in our teaching lives, but it's also important in our own lives as learners. Yeah. So thank you for being part of this continuing learning journey for so many of us. We all keep learning.
Okay, thanks, Sharon.
Yeah. So I'm just going to wrap up the podcast. And so thanks to everyone for joining us today. We love seeing that so many of you have subscribed to our episodes from all corners of the world. The Teachers Toolkit podcast is all about giving you an insider's guide to top teaching ideas, tools, techniques in literacy teaching, and especially in learning. Please subscribe to our weekly newsletter via the website. You will receive advance notice on blogs, podcasts, events, and ways to contact us. Thank you to everyone. Thank you, Brian. Thank you to our listeners, and we wish everybody all the very best. Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. To make sure you don't miss any literacy learning tips and insights, please subscribe to our show on your favourite podcast player. At Cue Learning, our literacy specialists draw on over 30 years of teaching and international consulting experience to deliver world-class learning solutions. We equip, empower and support teachers to become their authentic selves. To find out about upcoming webinars and about how Cue can help you and your school, visit cuelearning.com.au. And you can get even more amazing teaching resources right now at teachific.com.au. Stay tuned.